Thanks, Patricia. I got an inspiration when I was sitting there looking down at the audience, which had never struck me before, but I think it's significant enough. There's such an eclectic mix of people who come to the MacGill Summer School that you can never actually formulate a presentation that the majority of people will agree with you. You know, I just realised that that's impossible. It's a bit late to realise that when you're sitting up there, of course. But anyway, it's good to be back again. It's about 2 years since I was here. And you know, when you think about it, such a catalogue of disasters have really happened to us in that last 2 years. We've seen the value of the international stock markets halved, with all the implications that's had for pension schemes and for wealth in general. The banking system has imploded. The 15th of September, when Lehman Brothers collapsed, was a moment like the collapse of the Berlin Wall in terms of the current system. We've seen 4.5% inflation change to that level of deflation here in Ireland. And we've seen capitalism basically rescued by the state throughout the world. That, as a matter of fact, is what has happened. And Ireland, the crisis, I think, has been exacerbated by the issues surrounding the banking developer nexus that we're all very well aware of. The problem is that that has done enormous reputational damage to Ireland internationally. And it's very difficult to get to grips with that, because once you lose your reputation, it can take you a long time to build your reputation, but once you lose it, it can happen very quickly and it's hard to recall. What really happened, I suppose, with the banks was that they were borrowing money on the wholesale money markets to push it into an unsustainable consumer, essentially housing boom here. Statistically, net indebtedness of the banks to international markets in 2003 was around 10% of GDP, but it was 60% by 2008. And the boom, that huge bubble in property, couldn't have happened if that didn't happen. And the result is, of course, that the future of generations of people to come has been mortgaged in order to pay this back at levels that none of us, you know, the figures being spoken about are so enormous that they fall outside the normal person's field of comprehension almost. The NAM initiative, as we've seen, is on the way. The government seems to repose a huge amount of confidence in that. But looking at the events this week with the ACC Bank and the dangers that that might precipitate, basically the collapse of the NAM initiative and the requirement to fully nationalise the banks much quicker than most people expect. And nobody has been held accountable for all of that. And the interesting difference between us and the United States, I think, is that the Americans take capitalism very seriously. And anybody who breaks the rules in the United States gets what they deserve. We've seen Bernie Madoff get 150 years in jail. It's very doubtful if anybody in Ireland would see the inside of a prison at all for what has happened. But that is important, I think, from what I pick up from people, because people need to feel that there's some justice in how all of this is dealt with. It is the feeling that people, you know, who were in high positions did what they did, and the ordinary people who had nothing to do with the problem are picking up the tab for it. Not alone us of this generation, as I say, but generations to come. Now, I just make that, not to make any big political point about it, quite honestly, but just by way of context. Because when you look at the subject for discussion, you know, which is, can we get back to being competitive again? Against that background, it seems a little incongruous, quite honestly, that so much had happened, because that implies, get back to being competitive again, it implies a return to business as usual, which, quite honestly, I think is illusory. I do not believe that this is possible. I believe that the world of the last 3 decades is gone. I believe that neoliberalism has failed. The essential question now is what will replace it. I do not think it will be some form of Eastern European type socialism. I think it may very well be a modified form of capitalism. But who knows? But that is the biggest single question, I think, facing us for the future. Now, what about the competitiveness question itself? Funny enough, I agreed with some of the points that were being made by Patricia in her introduction, and some of them I didn't agree, probably just a difference of emphasis overall, because I think that a good deal of what is written in competitiveness theory is suspect. And there are a number of reasons for that. Like, maybe the best way for me is not to rely on my own interpretation of that, but to call upon a few statements from other people who are very eminent in the field and who have commented on it. The first person is Adair Turner, who is currently the chairman of the Financial Services Authority in the United Kingdom, but was formerly the Director General of the Confederation of British Industry. And in 1995, he wrote a book called Just Capital, which is a very interesting read. I mean, from his point of view, the emphasis on the word just, his belief in capitalism, all right, but within a certain framework. Now, one of the things he said about competitiveness was that by 1995, the CBI had carved out a name for itself as an advocate of competitiveness. In becoming its Director General, in a sense, I became the high priest of a cult whose beliefs I thought rather confused, but which I could not reject outright without causing confusion, ineffectiveness, and indeed offence. And later on in the book he said, the use of the word competitiveness pollutes and confuses real important debates about real important issues of public policy. It confuses the debate about the appropriate size and functions of the state, about the economic implications of different levels of tax and public spending. Now, Paul Krugman is also a sceptic about competitiveness, and he wrote in Proper Internationalism the following. He said, it's time to start telling the truth. Competitiveness is a meaningless concept when applied to national economies, and the obsession with competitiveness is both wrong and dangerous. And here in our own country, Professor Sean O'Reen of the National University of Ireland in Maynooth, he wrote a book a few years ago about the developmental network state. And he said this, he said, the difficulties of the Irish economy are less a matter of competitiveness than of a failure to build a deeper and more inclusive form of autocentric development around the developmental network state. That was in 2004. Nevertheless, tracking what has happened here in the summer school during the week and in a lot of what has been written in the newspapers in the last few weeks, the most common solution canvassed is that we need 15% wage cuts, we need to cut the minimum wage, we need to cut social welfare and public services, we need to reduce our cost base, all in order to compensate for our inability to adjust the value of our currency. Now, the problem with this analysis, as I see it, is this. The first is that if you were to follow it through, you would impart a huge deflationary shock to the economy. And I don't know of any country that has ever deflated its way out of a recession. Because if you look at it, personal consumption in Ireland has been around 60% of GDP for quite a few years now. It's less than, say, the United States, where it runs at about 70%. And in fact, it was growing quite strongly in the period between 2005 and 2007 by around 9%. And it grew less strongly in 2008 by 2.1%. But by first quarter of this current year, 2009, it had actually collapsed by a full 10%. Let's just park that for a second. Second point just to make about the global economy for a minute is not particularly well known, but in the first few months of this current year, shipping rates between China and Europe were set at $0, that the shipping agents were willing to move people's goods simply for the transaction costs of doing it, not the transport costs. And the reason for all of that really was that there was a huge collapse in exports by around 25% overall. So the global economy has really reduced very significantly. Now, this is significant if you are thinking of using, reducing costs in Ireland as a means to get a bounce out of the global economy. For reasons which I'll come back to in a minute, I don't think you will get a dead cat bounce even out of that. Now, we do have to confront the situation that our competitiveness has been reduced, principally in my view, by the currency problem, particularly with the sterling area and the dollar area. But we are not uncompetitive as a country. There is a difference between the two. I mean, our relative position on the World Economic Forum competitiveness report is number 22. And in fact, our export performance, although it has disimproved, is not as bad as other countries. For example, this year, I think our exports were down by 5.9%, but Germany's have been down by 16.5%, Italy's by 15.9%, and the United Kingdom by 9.8%. And the possibility is that our balance of payments will actually be in surplus this year. Now, in fairness, it can be pointed out that that has a lot to do with the collapse of economic activity domestically, not taking in imports. But here's the point I want to make. There's a great danger of a double whammy in all of this, that if we expect that by reducing costs we can improve our export base and the volume of our exports, you need to take into account that the conditions in the global market are so poor that that is very, very unlikely to happen at the moment, given what I've said about the 25% collapse. On the other hand, if you do that, you will further reduce consumer spending, you will be deflating into a deflationary situation, and you are in danger of a downward spiral. And the net result is we will be worse off, not better off. So you have a double whammy. Now, in fairness, the advocates of that strategy do also couch it in terms of we need to be ready for the recovery when it comes. So just consider for a minute, how likely is that? How likely is the recovery to come in any time soon? And we do hear people refer quite often to green shoots seen here and there. Now, my understanding is that there are really two causes to the international collapse as we know it at the moment. First is the global international financial system, which has imploded. And that really is the brain of the global market economy. And if the brain is in A&E, well, you know, the whole body is not in good shape. But I don't want to go into that particularly. I mean, that is a huge problem or a huge issue on its own. But in terms of trade, there are huge imbalances in the global economy between East and West. There are also huge imbalances in terms of savings as well. And in a sense, we're in a space at the moment where Europe is, in a way, waiting for the United States to provide the stimulus for global recovery. And the United States is waiting on China to get its imbalances corrected. Now, that requires of China that it would seriously address its currency relationship with the dollar and accept, if you like, that the dollar would fall relative to its currency. Now, that is a huge sacrifice to expect for two reasons. I mean, one is that so huge volume of Chinese reserves are held in dollar denominations, so it would lose an enormous amount of money as a result. And secondly, it would be stating effectively that it was departing from its export strategy. And you would be really asking China, you'd be saying, look, you have got to get your domestic demand going so that the goods otherwise produced for Europe and America, which can't happen, can be consumed internally in your economy. Now, on two occasions in the past, in 1971 and in 1985, the United States managed to get other countries, particularly Germany and Japan, to accept that the dollar, you know, should be devalued relative to their currency. There is a sort of an expectation that the United States or the IMF could dictate to China that the same thing would happen. But actually, if there's any dictating to be done, it's quite possibly going to be the other way around. So I don't think that it is a practical prospect, nor do I think that the prospect of China becoming a mass consumer market anytime soon will happen, because what you would be requiring would be the people who are the wage slaves of the world becoming the master consumers of the world. I don't think that's happening, and I think it is a glib view to suggest that it is happening and that we can take advantage of a recovery which is not far off as a result of that. And I really do believe that people who put forward that proposition need to be interrogated very closely as to the practical effect of it, because if they're asking ordinary people to take huge sacrifices, you need to be able to say that there's a reasonable chance of those sacrifices bringing about the result which you want to achieve. Now, insofar as the McCarthy report has been mentioned here this week, and it is seen as something of a public service component of competitiveness, I just want to make a few passing references to it from how I see it. First of all, I think that it will add, I'm sure people won't disagree with this, that if it were to be implemented as it is written, it would also add to the deflationary effect that I have described earlier on. But there's another aspect of it worthy of mention, and a person I know who's a very astute observer of these things coined a phrase on it which I thought was particularly telling. He said that it's a bit like reading the report, it's a bit like watching Plato's Guardians redesign the Republic from a blank slate. And in a sense, that is true. I mean, it has been said, I think, by Colin McCarthy himself, that, look, this is a list of options that can be chosen from. Frankly, I think it would be naive to believe that. I think my reading of it is a much more thought out and comprehensive document than that. But the issue is that it is slightly, it has a touch of anti-politics about it, if you like, in the sense that I'm not quite sure that any government can outsource a proposition like that. Because frankly, if it is done from the perspective just simply of the economy, and with great respect to the people who are involved in it, I mean, two of them at least, one is a senior banker, and the other, Colin McCarthy himself, as far as I understand his position, he is an economist of the neoclassical school. So, you know, excellent people, very fine people, very good people to contribute to the public service and all the rest of it, but people with a set of values as well. And I don't think that that can be taken out of the political realm. I also would say that trying to solve our current problems with an orthodoxy that's based on a system that's failed seems to me to be a foolish path to go down. I mean, if pro-cyclical fiscal policies contributed to the difficulties we have, or which at least exacerbated the difficulties in the earlier part of this decade, to apply the same solutions now and expect that we will find our salvation in them seems to be quite wrong. Frankly, it really is the antithesis of what I believe myself. I believe, frankly, that there is a changing relationship, and will have to be, between states and markets. And the state sector, if we are, or most countries apply the thing that the state has to grow in a recession where the private sector is contracting. And we are not doing that. We are going in the directly opposite direction. I think the old model is over. I think that's recognised by people like Greenspan, like Jack Welch, like Wolf, who writes in Martin Wolf in the Financial Times, and Warren Buffett. But it is enormously frustrating that that fundamental point is not really accepted here. So, to try and sum up, if I may, first of all, I believe with Krugman, whom I quoted, that competitiveness is relevant at the level of a firm, indeed probably of an industrial sector, but not of a country. I think that there are, though, things that a country can do to help firms and sectors of the economy become more competitive. And this is where I find myself coming into a bit more of alignment with what Patricia said. Take first of all the question of infrastructure. Somebody from RTE waylaid me on the way in there, and they were talking about the town here at Glenties and what it could do to boost itself for the future. And the first thing that strikes anybody, I hope I don't offend anybody in Glenties, but coming to it is how inaccessible it actually is. So it needs to be more accessible, it needs to be more, and that's infrastructure. And really in this country, going through the 80s, we went through a period where we ran down our infrastructure very significantly, and we never quite caught up with what we needed and the deficits that existed from the 1980s. And we're now in a position to actually do that with good value if we really wanted to, because there is great value to be got in construction activity at the moment. And it's not just, of course, direct bricks and mortar construction. It's construction in the sense of putting in broadband networks and things of that nature as well. And the downside of it is that if we don't do it now, we will lose the capacity to do it. Because if you look around, say, a place like Merrion Square in Dublin, where all the big architectural houses of the city are, those houses are closing down virtually at the moment. And the capacity in the system that is there and which would be enormously beneficial to us is dissipating at present. And we're accepting blindly, in a sense, that a whole industry, we have overbuilt, of course, in the sense of construction. But like, rather than say that that should all leak away, and to hell with the 400,000 people who are connected with that industry, we need to be thinking and saying, like, there are positive, constructive things we can do for those people and for the country as well for the future. And that is the real thing for being prepared for recovery when it comes, in a longer time frame, that we will at least, or could at least, have the infrastructure in place. I find it enormously frustrating that there doesn't seem to be any real thought given to how that could be done. And even though ideas, whether they're right ideas or not, have been put into the public domain about how it could happen, and in our own case we put forward the concept of a national recovery bond. The Construction Industry Council put forward the idea of using the pension funds, the private sector pension funds, to invest in Ireland. There must be a way of doing it and getting the money to do it. Second point, I completely agree with the point about the banking system. Clearly you need to have a functioning banking system to have a functioning commercial side to the economy. I think that's straightforward. Third point I would make is, I really do believe that we have to try and make efforts to keep people in employment, not to use the dead money to sort of prop up people when they're out of a job. Now, this is not hugely innovative. The idea of reduced working time with an input from the state in order to allow the time that's available, the spare time, to be used to upgrade skills and acquire better, actually a better competitiveness position overall for the company, is being done on the continent, in several continental countries. And we have proposed that to the government, but the government haven't been willing to take that up. They have come forward with a kind of an idea about an employment subsidy, which is not the same thing at all. And I don't see, when we know something works elsewhere, why we won't attempt to do that. Now, overall, these ideas and others, for us, we have put into a concept called a social solidarity pact. Because we believe, frankly, that the dominant emotions that we see in people at the moment are anger and fear. And unless we can manage to stabilise our country, we will have everybody going away in different directions and internal squabbling and fighting, and no concept of the common good will be able to gauge traction at all. And to do that, you do need justice. And that's the point I made at the very beginning. People do need to see that people who were responsible for what happened are taken to task about all of this. And in the process, you might go some way towards repairing the reputational damage as well. And unless I think we can manage to do this, actual competitiveness as a concept in itself, will be the least of our worries. I just want to finish making a couple of points about something else. I mean, in terms of how our country is structured for the future, I do think we have to conceive of a different model. And I want to go back to Sean Oreen's view, the book he wrote on the developmental network state, and he said in the concluding paragraph of that, and it is a political point essentially, but I mean, you just need to accept that the Irish trade union movement is a social democratic movement like the rest of Europe, so we have a social democratic point of view. So I want to quote from Sean Oreen, and this is what he said. He said, developmental states expose more clearly the political choice between neoliberalism and social democracy. In a time when neoliberalism promises financial speculation, impoverishment, corporate criminality and permanent war, the choice is clear between social democracy and barbarism. Now that is a fairly strong statement, but he made it in the year 2004, so it was a prescient, actually, at least in some aspects, of what has happened to us since. But let me try and interpret it in one sense, in the context of something which has happened here this week. There has been this debate about the need to cut everything, to cut wages, to cut public services, to cut social welfare. We had the Minister for Finance contributing to that last night as well, although I understand he didn't say what he said in open session, but rather in an interview with the media. Nevertheless, one has to accept that the Minister for Finance chooses his words fairly cautiously. I find difficulty with what he said, I have to say, and with these other propositions, and I'll try and explain why in the context of that particular quote. Because I believe fundamentally that the glue, the formula, if you like, which holds any country together, no matter what your standpoint is a combination of economic efficiency, individual personal freedom, and social justice. Now, on those three, if you accept that analysis, these cuts in the most basic of incomes, whether it's social welfare related, and I need to make a point about social welfare, by the way, that people who are on unemployment benefit have contributed to a social insurance fund all their life. It's not some handout by the state, it's their money, it's what they're actually entitled to. But think of it in economic efficiency terms. That money is so low that everything that's paid out to them is pushed back into the economy again, because none of it is discretionary spending. That's the point. People have to live. They have to put that money back in. But from the social justice dimension of it, my personal view is that there must be some threshold of decency below which we don't go, no matter how bad things get. And it seems to me that cutting the minimum wage and cutting social welfare benefits, that is below that threshold of decency. And there is a real danger emerging in the country, in my view, that the political and economic elite can take time off this week to come up here to Glenties and to say to the world and to the country what they want, their view, what should be cut and what should be not done and what suffering people should take. But they need to be aware that there is, at least in my experience, a growing chasm between that point of view and the point of view of ordinary people. And the only thing that contains their fury and anger at the moment is their fear, quite honestly. And that may not endure forever. And I worry greatly about that, and I worry about the general direction. And I say this honestly, by the way. I have no monopoly of wisdom about what should be done about this. But I do think that some effort needs to be made to get the people of the country behind some common approach to how we're going to get out of this. And you won't do that unless you can convince people that it has been done in a just and a fair way. That's the challenge I think we face. Thanks very much.